Hey everybody, welcome to Conversations. My name's Micah. I am the executive teaching pastor at Lifegate Church, and I'm so glad that you're joining us here on this special episode of Conversations. You'll see why in just a second. Many of you, if you've been tracking with us, you know that we are using this podcast in this season as a supplement to our weekend services. And so the best way to go about these podcasts is to find the week that we posted it and tie it with that week's sermon, and you will get the most from the combination of those two things. Well, this week, the platform here is going to be a little different because, as you can imagine, with a podcast entitled Conversations, the goal is to bring on a friend or a coworker or someone in my life who I can have a conversation with regarding the weekend message topic. However, this week, it was such a full week, and I preached this week, and it was such a full message that I didn't get to everything I really wanted to share. And so I am, in just a brief amount of time here, going to do more of a monologue than a conversation. I want to share some stuff that didn't quite make it into this weekend's message. If you haven't listened to it, it's May 31st. It's on our website or on our app. You can check it out. Love in All Things was the name of the sermon. And here's what I talked about, was this idea that many times where we struggle to fully mature into love, which is what we've been talking about lately, is growing our lives in an intentional way into love by practicing the ways of Jesus. Many times the place we struggle is we understand certain things as disciplines or practices where following the way of Jesus makes sense, like reading my Bible or praying or worshiping or attending church. But oftentimes what we don't understand is, what do we do with the other 100 or so waking hours of our week? How do we really infuse Jesus into every area of our life? And so this past weekend, I talked about two areas of our lives: the relational side of our lives and what I called the restoration side of our lives, and how we can infuse the practices of Jesus into those areas. The relational obviously has to do with the relationships in our lives, and recognizing that Jesus's life gives us insight in how to relate with other people. Many of us have a lot of unhealthy, dysfunctional relationships in our lives, and sometimes we may not recognize that you have these relationships that are built on principles or values that are not aligned with the way Jesus did relationship. Jesus did relationship in vulnerable and intimate community. Jesus was all about confession and forgiveness, though he didn't have to do a lot of confession. He did a lot of forgiving of the disciples. Jesus was all about speaking openly and honestly with people, and you see this in his life. And so his relationships reflected health because there were certain practices that he put in place that we can practice as well. The other area I talked about was restore or restoration, those practices in our lives that speak to or allow us to grow in our emotional, mental, financial, and physical health. Now, some of you may be saying, how in the world did those types of practices, rhythms, and routines make me, if you remember our end goal, make me a person of love? But here's the deal. The way you eat will make you more available to love others. The way you sleep will make you more available to love others, meaning the way you care for your body actually will make you a more loving person, because the more energy you have, the more vibrancy you have, the more loving you're going to be. The more tired and sluggish you are, the less loving you're going to be. And you may say, well, where in the world do we see advice on sleeping and eating in the life of Jesus? Remember, Jesus was a Jewish man. He built his life off of the wisdom of the Old Testament. There's great wisdom in the Old Testament, how we live our lives, how we pattern our lives. You look in the first 5 books of the Bible, there's insight into all areas of our lives. Look in Proverbs, look in Psalms, these books of wisdom, and you'll see great insight into how to live our lives, how to sleep, how to eat, how to rest, how to recreate even. We see those types of things in Psalms and the way that we enjoy nature. And so the life of Jesus actually has a lot to say about our relationships with others, and then how we take care of this body and soul that he has given us. And many followers of Jesus have their spiritual growth stunted. They don't really grow into flourishing, love-filled people because they don't understand that it's not just quote unquote spiritual practices that form us into love, prayer, study, scripture, but it's also all the practices are spiritual practices that form us into a people of love. And encourage you to think about that a little bit, ponder that whole idea a little bit, and then add this to it. This is a new concept I didn't have time to get to this weekend, but I think is so, so important for trying to understand how to pattern our life after the way of Jesus. And it's this, it's presented by a man named Dallas Willard, who is a genius when it comes to the spiritual disciplines. The Spirit of the Disciplines is this book. And he talks about the idea that spiritual disciplines, or practices as we're calling them, practicing the way of Jesus, really fall into two categories that work together, that cooperate with one another. And those two categories are practices of abstinence and practices of engagement. Practices of abstinence are things that we abstain from. For a certain period of time, we pull back from. And those can be good things. They're not just like I'm trying to stop doing a bad habit, but it could be, a great example is like fasting. Food is good, but there are times when it's wise and godly to pull away from food and to recognize that our ultimate source of life is God, even more than our food. That's a practice of abstinence. But then there's practices of engagement where we actually do things. We actually add things in to our lives. And so an example of that would be prayer, that we actually engage in this act of prayer. We add it into our lives. And Willard points out how these two things work together. So disciplines of abstinence are kind of like exhaling. We're releasing something when we breathe. We let go of it. And disciplines of engagement are like inhaling. We take something in. And we know this in our human makeup, that we can't just always exhale or we'll die. And we can't just always inhale because our lungs have a limited capacity. And so inhale and exhale, these things work together to allow us to thrive as people and get the oxygen that we need. The same is true with the spiritual practices, that as we infuse into our lives practices of abstaining and then practices of engagement, as we do those two things in our lives, it allows there to be this, I would even call it like this spiritual momentum, where we begin to not just go through the motions, but actually like hit our stride in God. And it's a beautiful way to live. Let me give you some examples of each of these. Disciplines of abstinence are things like solitude, pulling away from people; silence, pulling away from the noise; fasting, as I mentioned, pulling away from food; simplicity, saying no to stuff, whether it's for a season or maybe like limiting your shopping and really just setting a budget, those types of things. Purity is another great example of sexual purity, is an example of abstinence. Then disciplines of or practices of engagement would be things like study or meditation or memorization of scripture. Worship would be a great picture or a great example of engagement. Prayer, as I mentioned earlier, celebration, service, confession, all of these are examples of engaging in something. Now, here's where all of this starts to come together, and I think is really helpful for us. Some of us, depending on how you're wired and how you view relationship with God, you may kind of lean towards disciplines of abstinence. For you, you may kind of focus on all the things you can't do, all the stuff you need to cut out of your life, or all the ways you need to simplify or cut back. I know for me, when I was in a season of just real like young kids and job was getting full and life was getting full, it became very difficult for me to keep up with everything. And so I was like, man, I just want to cut stuff out of my life. Some of us are drawn towards those types of things. Others of us are just naturally drawn towards, I want to do more. Like I've fallen in love with Jesus. I want to grow in him. I want to read scripture. I want to pray. I want to worship. And we try to do these things and because we're hungry, right? And both of those are good. The problem is if you only live in one camp or the other, eventually you will lack the momentum to keep going. And here's what I mean by that. If all you're doing is abstaining from stuff and not engaging in anything new, then what you're doing is you're creating space, but you're not filling it with anything. So a great example is I'm fasting lunch on a particular day, but I'm just kind of sitting there bored because I usually eat and I'm not hanging out with anybody because we usually go to lunch together. So what am I going to do? Well, a great example would be to fill that time with engagement. I'm going to engage in a practice or two during the time that I created for myself by fasting. And it's in breathing, remember? And so I'm going to exhale out food. I'm going to not do food, but I'm going to inhale prayer and scripture during my lunch hour. And doing those two things together, you'll come out of your lunch hour feeling like, man, that was great. Instead of, God, that was long and boring and I didn't know what to do. Others of us, if all we focus on is doing more, practices of engagement, but we don't create space in our lives around the practices of abstinence, then we just overly busy ourselves. And we do what so many followers of Jesus do, which is we get exhausted and we feel like following Jesus is hard, it's tiresome, it's laborsome. It's all of the things that Jesus did not describe in Matthew chapter 11 when he says, come follow me, for my yoke is easy. The way of following Jesus is easy and the burden is light, right? These are the types of words that Jesus uses to describe life with him, easy and light. But if all you're doing is adding stuff, heaping stuff onto your life that you need to do, it will not feel easy or light. A great example of this that encompasses both abstinence and engagement is Sabbath, right? Pastor Les talked about this 2 weeks ago, that if we really embrace Sabbath as a normal part of our weekly rhythm, and we say no to work, we say no to responsibilities, we say no to the chore list, if all we do is say no to all that stuff, we might just get bored out of our minds. I know I would. So there's other things that we need to say yes to. We need to say yes to quality time with those we love. We say yes to good food and celebrating God's goodness to us together around the table, which is what my family does. We say yes to some time in scripture and some time worshiping together. We say yes to we just eat a ton of sugar on Sabbath because it is just life-giving for us one day out of the week. Actually, I should limit it just to Sabbath, but we overindulge on Sabbath, right? And so as you do those two things together, what happens is what we're experiencing in our home, which is we love Sabbath. All of our kids love Sabbath. We can't wait for Sabbath. Our kids love it because dad and mom say no to work and chores and responsibilities, and they don't have to do any chores. They love that. But we don't just sit around the house and do nothing. We actually do fun things together. We actually celebrate one another. We actually engage one another. And so our kids love it. And that's the momentum I'm talking about, the spiritual momentum that happens when we understand abstaining and engaging and how those two things work together. They actually give us a taste of this life that Jesus described as light and easy because we get some momentum going in our lives. So I want to encourage you, I want to challenge you to try and pick up a practice of engagement and a practice of Sabbath this week, abstinence this week that will work together. And so, for instance, you might say, I'm not going to shop as much this week. I'm going to just kind of say what I have right now is enough. I'm trusting God and I'm content in God. That's a great spiritual practice of simplicity. But then you might also want to say, but with that, I'm going to take the money I would typically spend on my little Friday Target run or whatever, and I'm going to find a way to be a blessing to somebody else with those finances. And you might just find that the no you said to shopping gave you, the yes you said to generosity actually increased your joy and makes you want to do it again the following week. So pick up an act of abstaining and an act of engagement. Tie them together this week. See how it goes for you. I would love to hear how it goes for you. You can find me on Facebook or Instagram, email me, let me know how this is working for you. Love you guys so much, and y'all have an awesome week.